Hey, Scott Horton here to tell you about this great new book by Michael Swanson, The War State. In The War State, Swanson examines how Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy both expanded and fought to limit the rise of the new national security state after World War II. If this nation is ever to live up to its creed of liberty and prosperity for everyone, we are going to have to abolish the empire. Know your enemy. Get The War State by Michael Swanson. It's available at your local bookstore or at Amazon.com in Kindle or in paperback. Just click the book in the right margin at scotthorton.org or thewarstate.com. All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. Hey, I'm going to be on Daily Paul Radio tonight with Allison Bricker. I guess during and or maybe it's after the State of the Union. And then I guess Rand Paul's going to have a response, and so I'm going to have my say. Ow, I bit my tongue. I'm going to have my say after that over there at Daily Paul Radio tonight. Sometime, I don't know, check it out over there. dailypaul.com. All right, so next up on the show is our old friend John Feffer. He's co-director of Foreign Policy in Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies, and he's the author of several books, including Crusade 2.0. A Tom Dispatch regular, he's currently writing a book about Eastern Europe 25 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And his own website is johnfeffer.com. And you know, I'm sorry, John, I meant to catch up on all your great stuff, your tour of Eastern Europe and all that stuff. I never did. That website is now on my pile of books I'm supposed to get to, and maybe it'll happen someday. I really would like to, if that counts for anything. Welcome back to the show. How are you doing?
Fine. Thanks for having me back on.
All right, good times. Hey, listen, so you've written two very good, very important, very different articles I'd like to talk with you about. I'd like to spend more time on the Asia thing, really. But let's start with Iraq, revisiting the Pottery Barn Rule. The sub-headline here reads that in Iraq, the U.S. broke a nation of human beings, and it owes them an apology and a restitution. And I appreciate you being subtle and understated about it, because, you know, that hardly gets across the devastation and the unraveling of Iraqi society. It wasn't just that there was a war there. It was every bit of what had been woven together there became unraveled and horrible and bloody during that American occupation. So go ahead and make your case. The floor is yours.
Well, and the unraveling continues. I mean, we continue to get reports of the devastation in Iraq today. And it's, as you know, U.S. troops for the most part have been withdrawn from Iraq. And this, has been held up as one of Obama's, chief accomplishments over the last few years to actually end the war in Iraq and pull out U.S. troops. And, of course, there was an attempt at one point to keep U.S. troops there, to negotiate some kind of status of forces agreement with the al-Maliki government. That failed. We deployed the so-called zero option. We pulled everybody out. Of course, we still have some folks there, some Marines at the U.S. Embassy, some trainers who are overseeing kind of provision of military supplies to the government, but for the most part, we're out. But, we seem to have basically washed our hands of the situation, and we see we have no responsibility for the damage that we did. And so in the article, basically what I talk about is, number one, we focus on this Pottery Barn thing, which is all about, if you break it, you own it, which of course was not the Pottery Barn rule at all. With all retailers, basically, if you broke something, they wrote it off as a loss. And that really is what we've done. We've written Iraq off as a loss. And we seem to have no intention of doing the basic things. And the basic thing would be, number one, to apologize for what we did, and then to provide some form of restitution. And in the article, I talk about, the psychic pain that many of the veterans feel, and the tremendous guilt they have over their role in this, and the fact that there's so little they feel they can do. They try as much as possible, in some cases, to find Iraqi refugees who have settled in the United States. But what I imagine is some other form of restitution in which the United States, in some sense, tries to repair the damage that the United States was at least in part responsible for. And so that's what the article is about.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's funny, you couldn't really put the military back there, active duty military back there in the middle of this violence. And I mean, I guess there are some places where you could send troops where, they could do something nice without, being in the middle of a firefight or something like that. But maybe they could start in Laos and pick up the cluster bomb units laying around in Laos and Cambodia where, I mean, for the active duty, as far as the veterans that you're talking about, hey, everybody go and do whatever you want. But I kind of envision ending the entire empire and putting the entire army to work cleaning up depleted uranium dust in Kosovo and Serbia and in Iraq, of course, and cleaning up so-called dud munitions in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia and on like that. There's a lot to be done.
Absolutely. And I wasn't imagining, of course, active duty returning to Iraq, and that is... No,
I didn't mean to sound like I was trying to contradict you on that, but I was just kind of going off my own direction about what actual use the U.S. Army could be in the world. How about making up for past sins, and then we would have a whole army worth of guys out there cleaning up cluster bomb units,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And, there have been some efforts, not for active duty, but for veterans to return to Vietnam and do what they can in that situation. And, there have been quite a few veterans who have participated in that. But that's been, that's like 20, 30, 40, and coming up now, years after the case. And are we going to wait 30, 40 years, for things to get even worse in Iraq before we turn our attention there again? I think we do have to think about what our responsibility, not as a military, not as the Pentagon's responsibility, even if it was the Pentagon who was responsible for this, but our responsibility as a nation toward Iraq, and not just, as you say, toward Iraq, toward all the countries in the world that we have, spent years and decades tearing apart in many ways.
Well, there's a real problem there because, whenever we talk about we and they like that, ultimately, most of the time we're talking about our governments and their policies. And you can't really have transfer payments from our government to anyone in Iraq without it being the wrong people in Iraq, right? They can't just put $10,000 in everybody's pocket and call it even that way and say sorry, which would be nice, but it would take magic to do, right? So then there's really no way to do it without just giving the money to the Badr Corps and letting them decide who gets it, their favorite torturers or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I don't really envision, a huge transfer payment in this sense. Of course, we have seen the Pentagon engage in those kinds of payments to the victims of drone attacks and so on. But what I envision is something, more on the lines of Civil Corps of Engineers or Army Corps of Engineers. Folks go in there and build bridges, repair schools, build roads, infrastructure development, rather than payments to particular individuals or to particular neighborhoods.
Well, and back to the question of security, though. I mean, they really can't do that without getting killed.
Oh, at the moment, it's going to be very difficult, especially in the areas that are under, the greatest conflict right now, such as Fallujah and so forth. There are other areas of the country that are less conflict-ridden, and I suspect it would be possible to do it there. But this is a long-range plan. This is something that I think we have to commit to as a country. It's not something that we're going to do in the midst of battle, either in Iraq or Afghanistan. It's something we have to reorient our foreign policy toward. It'd be a foreign policy of reconstruction rather than a foreign policy of destruction.
Yeah. Well, what about, because I don't know, I worry that maybe conservative Republican types would just be too humiliated by such a thing. Maybe we could compromise and just promise to not be in any wars for 50 years, no matter what. And then hope the Iraqis will settle for that. That we promise not to do to anyone what we did to you for at least 50 years.
Yeah, well, I'm sure
that was Eric Garris's idea.
Sure
that way we're not having to mandate a new policy of any kind. We just promise to stop having policies.
Yeah. Well, the symbolism, for instance, of U.S. policy toward Japan and towards nuclear weapons. I mean, we, in some sense, could go, Obama as president could go to Hiroshima, and there has been no standing president who has visited Hiroshima. And if Obama went there, it wouldn't make sense to say, well, of course, we're going to repair Japanese society or repair Hiroshima or whatever. I mean, the bombing of Hiroshima, Nagasaki took place a long time ago. But there is great symbolism for the president to go there and say, I'm recommitting to nuclear abolition, recommitting to, a policy by which the United States makes dramatic cuts in our nuclear arsenal. That is an important that has important symbolism over and beyond anything we have done to support Japan after 1945 and its reconstruction efforts.
Yeah. Well, I was for the Paul Kucinich ticket 08. Things could be a lot better by now in so many regions of the world if you think about it, how long it's been now that we could have been out of all these places for real and for good,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh, well.
Absolutely.
I don't get my way. That's not how it works.
Well, that brings us over to Asia, where we are theoretically involved in a pivot to reorient our foreign policy away from our failures and fiascos in the Middle East.
Now, here's the thing. We got very little time before we go out to this break, actually a minute and a half or so. But now, so is the pivot to Asia mostly just cover for withdrawing from the Middle East, and we got to do something to make work, like the Army talks about in Africa, that, we're just looking for a mission because we don't have any.
Well, the U.S. has had a mission in the Pacific for quite some time. You could argue it's ever since Teddy Roosevelt in the turn of the century. So in some sense, the Pacific pivot is a reassertion of U.S. mission in Asia. Mission might have changed somewhat, but for the most part, we're not talking about finding a new mission in a new part of the world. We're talking about an attempt to reassure our allies and to go up against what has emerged as really the only challenge to the United States in terms of world power in the world, and that would be China.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, I read, I believe it was Colonel Basevich in the Los Angeles Times talking about how, the Army's pivot to Africa is sort of their consolation prize for not really having anything to do with the pivot back to Asia. And so, they get to go ahead and invade Africa, occupy this, that, or the other country, because they don't get to be part of containing China so much anymore.
The Army still thinks it can kind of reinsert itself into Asia. It has put forward this Pacific Pathways Initiative, which, is an attempt to say, hey, we're going to basically do what the Marines are doing. But it's pretty unlikely they're going to be able to convince the Pentagon as a whole to support it.
All right, well, hold it right there. When we get back, we're going to talk all about the Pacific pivot with John Feffer. He's got this great one at TomDispatch.com, The Empire's New Asian Clothes, Why America's Strategic Rebalance is Really Just Retreat. I like the sound of that. Hang tight. We'll be right back. Don't worry about things you can't control. Isn't that what they always say? But it's about impossible to avoid worrying about what's going on these days. The government has used the war on guns, the war on drugs, and the war on terrorism to tear our Bill of Rights to shreds. But you can fight back. The 10th Amendment Center has proven it, racking up major victories. For example, when the U.S. government claimed authority in the NDAA to have the military kidnap and detain Americans without trial, the nullifiers got a law passed in California, declaring the state's refusal to ever participate in any such thing. Their latest project is offnow.org, nullifying the National Security Agency. They've already gotten model legislation introduced in California, Arizona, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Kansas, meant to limit the power of the NSA to spy on Americans in those states. We'd be fools to wait around for the U.S. Congress or courts to roll back Big Brother. Our best chance is nullification and interposition on the state level. Go to offnow.org, print out that model legislation, and get to work nullifying the NSA. The hero Edward Snowden has risked everything to give us this chance. Let's take it. Offnow.org. All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with John Feffer. He's got a new piece at TomDispatch.com. Oh, I should tell you that last piece, the Iraq piece, revisiting the Pottery Barn rule, I'm not sure if I mentioned, that's at fpif.org, Foreign Policy in Focus. Great bunch of writers over there. fpif.org, Iraq Revisiting the Pottery Barn Rule. And so now we're talking about this piece at Tom Dispatch, which will be running on antiwar.com tomorrow. It's John Feffer, The Empire's New Asian Clothes. And then the subhead here is why America's strategic rebalance is really just retreat. And that sounds good to me, as I said, going out to break. But then I thought, man, that probably doesn't sound very good to people. Maybe we should call it victory while we retreat. What do you think?
Well, it's interesting that you put it that way, because that's something I think the Obama administration would like to avoid. It would like to avoid any kind of association with Iraq, of course, and it wants to avoid kind of disturbing our allies. Our allies are, in this case, Japan, South Korea, to a certain extent, Indonesia, Thailand, certainly Australia, have been eager for the United States to pay more attention to Asia, not to retreat. And they have been urging the United States to stop pouring so many resources into the Middle East, and to pour some of those resources into the Asia-Pacific region. And in part, the Pacific pivot is designed to allay their suspicions that the United States is in fact retreating. But if you look at the numbers, you see that the United States, in fact, has been retreating from Asia for the last several decades. We've seen a reduction in U.S. forces in Korea, on the Korean Peninsula, from around 70,000 back in the Nixon era to about 28,000 today. We've seen a reduction in Japan, and a further reduction planned when the Futenma Marine Air Force Base is closed, and they relocate those Marines in other places. And we have seen an effort by the Pentagon to say, hey, we are going to push some resources into the Asia-Pacific region. For instance, we're going to shift our balance of the fleet, the U.S. fleet, from 50-50, the Pacific and the rest of the world, to 60-40, with the advantage to the Pacific. But again, if you look at the numbers, we're looking at actually a much smaller fleet, so it doesn't really matter what the ratio is. There's going to be fewer ships going to be there. And with, belt tightening eventually going to take place in the Pentagon, it's not going to take place this year. We're going to see the beginning of it next year. We're going to see a reduction of forces overall. And that's going to have a profound impact on the region. And I can talk a little bit more about that if you like.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I want to get into all of that. But first of all, let me ask you this. Because, whatever. I know most people don't agree with me about everything, but it seems to me like we don't even hardly really need a Navy at all. Give them an aircraft carrier, too, a few good submarines, and it's not like we could ever have a war, a real war with China without losing Los Angeles over it. So since that's off the table, then what are we even talking about here other than pretending that China is an adversary worth arming up against when really they're our best friend and trading partner other than the Canadians? And we have a long future of inhabiting this planet to look forward to together. And so what in the hell do we need a Navy at all for at this point when we're allies with the EU, when the Russians don't hardly have one at all, and when the Chinese are only barely building theirs up because of our pivot and encirclement of them?
Mm-hmm. Well, you make a compelling argument, and certainly if you're sitting, in the U.S. Trade Office, or you're sitting anywhere in Wall Street, or you're sitting with, the firms, the high-tech firms and the IT firms on the West Coast, they're all going to agree with you. It makes absolutely no sense to have any kind of military confrontation with China, especially when we have, this pretty deep economic relationship with them. On the other hand, if you're sitting in the Pentagon or you're sitting in the President's office, it's a slightly different perspective, because what they're looking at is they're looking at Taiwan. We made basically a security commitment to Taiwan that we'd protect them in the case of any aggression on the part of the mainland. And in order to protect Taiwan, that's what we need the Navy for. I mean, we need a lot of other things, apparently. We also need to send Taiwan, huge amounts of military weaponry. But that's the commitment the United States made. That's number one. I mean, that's where the conflict's going to come. It's not going to come, say, over, China trying to invade Los Angeles or even some kind of conflict in Central America over resources or over oil in Africa or even in the South China Sea. The issue is going to be over Taiwan. Now, folks in the Pentagon might say they need the Navy for a couple other things. They might need the Navy in case of a quote-unquote contingency on the Korean Peninsula if something happened between North and South Korea. They need the Navy for dealing with counterterrorism operations, although, frankly, most of that's done with special operations.
On the Taiwan question, John, wouldn't that sort of be like losing Estonia or one of those further eastern NATO allies? Yeah, we didn't really mean it when we said we're willing to lose our capital city for yours, so sorry. I mean, if China decided they were really going to take Taiwan by force, I mean, do you think the American government would really be willing to get into a hydrogen bomb exchange with Beijing over that and lose American cities over Taiwan? Or our bluff would be called and sorry, Taiwan, right? That's sure as hell what I would do.
Here's the thing. No, I don't think the Washington would make a decision like that. However,
I mean, that's their promise, but it's a hollow promise, right? Or not?
Well, here's the thing. China doesn't really have a very big nuclear capability. It's nothing like what Russia had or continues to have today.
No, a couple of dozens is pretty good, though, when it comes down to H-bombs.
Well, yes and no. I mean, one of the key elements of the Pacific pivot, and it has been this way actually prior to the Pacific pivot, is missile defense in the region. And China's quite upset in missile defense because it sees missile defense as basically eliminating deterrence, essentially making China's nuclear force unusable. Now, I don't think missile defense actually works, but this is all speculative. This is all hypothetical. China's, concerned that, it doesn't have the nuclear weapons to use. Any conflict, therefore, that involved Taiwan would not involve an exchange of nuclear weapons, or at least it wouldn't involve China using nuclear weapons. So anyway, that's, I think, at some level why the Pentagon argues that it needs the Navy. It still thinks that some kind of a conventional war would take place across the Taiwan Strait. Mm-hmm. But again, I mean, this is all wargaming. I mean, I don't.
Well, the Taiwanese military has been armed up at this point to the degree where they could at least hurt the Chinese badly for any attack, right? Make them pay for it if
they
not
could.
Win.
They could, but it's not like South Korea vis-a-vis North Korea. I mean, essentially, in any kind of conflict involving Taiwan, it would require the United States to be, in some sense, the equalizer, whereas on the Korean Peninsula, South Korea can take care of itself in any kind of conflict with North Korea. So I think that's where we have the challenge. Now, that said, the relationship between mainland and Taiwan is in some ways very similar to the relationship between the United States and China. The two countries are economically dependent on one another, or I should say Taiwan is economically dependent on mainland not so much on Taiwan. There's an enormous amount of investment coming from Beijing into Taiwan. There's an enormous number of Taiwanese who operate factories in the mainland with Taiwanese workers who come over from Taiwan. So the economic relationship is very strong. If we're talking about any kind of potential conflict between Taiwan and China, that too is mitigated by this very strong economic relationship.
Right, yeah, the status quo is pretty good, and it seems like from here, assuming no black swan kind of crazy thing happens, you would assume that they would eventually negotiate a Hong Kong type status of autonomy and strong alliance and more or less, shared sovereignty kind of a deal like that would be mutually beneficial, assuming, again, nothing bad happens. That's the future of those two states, right?
I would like to believe that. But there is a pretty strong constituency in Taiwan that rejects that out of hand.
Yeah.
They haven't won in the elections recently. They were in charge for a while, but they didn't win in the previous elections. But they still represent a significant portion of the population. Were that party to once again come into power, then we might see a different scenario. We might see an increase in tension. We might see the Taiwanese government declare de facto, not just de facto, but de jure independence and seek status at the UN and other international organizations. That would be a problem from the mainland.
And now, John, I'm sorry, because I'm getting in your way and stepping all over your point, which I never really let you get back to, and we're almost out of time here if you want to wrap up.
Sure. The key thing I want to point out here is that as the United States is withdrawing from Asia, even as it declares that it's returning to the Pacific pivot, what it's effectively doing is pushing its allies out in front, arming our allies, involving them in ever more sophisticated modernization, ever more sophisticated trainings and maneuvers. We are pushing them to increase their spending on their own militaries. And so this is a major problem. One place in the world where there is a major arms race going on right now is Asia. We're seeing global military spending finally peak and decline over the last year or two, except in Asia. And the United States is in part responsible for this because it wants, in some sense, to withdraw under the cover of major military upgrade on the part of our allies. And that's been very destabilizing. We see the results of that today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's supposed to be stabilizing, right? But it's the opposite, as everything
exactly.
we do. All right. Well, thanks very much. I'm sorry we're all out of time, but it's a great article, great couple of articles. Thanks again, John.
Been a pleasure. Take care.
All right, that's the great John Feffer, TomDispatch.com, and Foreign Policy and Focus, FPIF.org. Thanks for listening, y'all. See you tomorrow. Hey, y'all, Scott here. First, I want to take a second to thank all the show's listeners, sponsors, and supporters for helping make the show what it is. I literally couldn't do it without you. And now I want to tell you about the newest way to help support the show. Whenever you shop at Amazon.com, stop by ScottHorton.org first, and just click the Amazon logo on the right side of the page. That way, the show will get a kickback from Amazon's end of the sale. It won't cost you an extra cent. And it's not just books. Amazon.com sells just about everything in the world, except cars, I think. So whatever you need, they've got it. Just click the Amazon logo on the right side of the page at ScottHorton.org, or go to ScottHorton.org/Amazon. Hey y'all, Scott here. So you made a little bit of money in this horrid economy only to find that the Fed has more or less outlawed saving. So into the treacherous waters of the stock market bubble you go. But how to make a little money without too much risk of losing it all? Check out WallStreetWindow.com. Mike Swanson is a successful former hedge fund manager who opens a very real window into his main account, updating his subscribers on the facts of and the reasoning behind all his market moves. Follow along on paper or with real money and see what happens at WallStreetWindow.com. What was the only interest group in D.C. pushing war with Syria last summer? AIPAC and the Israel lobby. What's the only interest group in D.C. pushing to sabotage the nuclear deal with Iran right now? AIPAC and the Israel lobby. Why doesn't the president force an end to the occupation of Palestine, a leading cause of terrorist attacks against the United States? AIPAC and the Israel lobby. But the Council for the National Interest is pushing back, putting America first and educating the people about what's really at stake in the Middle East. Help support their important work at councilforthenationalinterest.org. Hey, I'm Scott Horton here for The Future of Freedom, the monthly journal of the Future Freedom Foundation at fff.org/subscribe. Since 1989, FFF has been pushing an uncompromising moral and economic case for peace, individual liberty, and free markets. Sign up now for The Future Freedom, featuring founder and president Jacob Hornberger, as well as Sheldon Richmond, James Bovard, Anthony Gregory, Wendy McElroy, and many more. It's just $25 a year for the print edition, $15 per year to read it online. That's fff.org/subscribe. And tell them Scott sent you.